Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very excited to have back on the podcast Jonathan Losos. Jonathan is an evolutionary biologist at Washington University and the founding director of the Living Earth Collaborative, which is a unique biodiversity center with Washington University, St. Louis Zoo, and Missouri Botanical Garden. He's previously taught at Harvard, and he's been a curator at the university's Museum of Comparative Zoology. He's won many awards from the National Academy of Sciences, Society for the Study of Evolution, and American Society of Naturalists. He has been on the podcast before. We talked about his previous book, Improbable Destinies, which, again, as I say in the conversation, is still, I think, one of the best popular science books on convergent evolution that's around. It's still the kind of standard for me. It's absolutely fantastic, and I highly recommend everyone picking up that book and listening to that conversation. Today, we are talking about his newest book. It's titled The Cat's Meow: How Cats Evolved from the Savannah to Your Sofa. When I chatted with Jonathan previously, he was working on the book. And when I found out that it was an evolutionary history of sorts of cats, I was thrilled. And I said, I must have you come on again, and we got to talk about it. As some of you may know, I've mentioned in different podcasts, I'm a big cat lover, both for the cats that I have in my house and just cats in general on the planet. So, and there's not a lot of really good popular science books on cats and their evolutionary history and behavior, and just a kind of one source for all that. There's a lot of fun fact books and things, or looking at one angle of cats, or but just really getting the whole scope of it from an evolutionary framework is not really out there. And I must say, Jonathan knocked this one out of the park. I mean, it's a fabulous book. It's fantastic. Even if you're not a cat lover or a cat owner, I think you'll have a much bigger appreciation. And for all of those that are cat owners or cat lovers like myself, it'll be one of your favorite books you read this year. So it's absolutely marvelous. We start the conversation by talking about this claim that cats, at least house cats, are semi-domesticated and how they're not fully domesticated, and he basically confirms this, which is true. More interesting, though, is that all cats that live on the planet are not that different. There's a lot of similarities with cats all over the planet, which is just deeply fascinating. We talk about cats and how they meow and how they purr to humans and kind of minimally to other cats. We talk about cat sociality and some of the differences between tame versus domesticated. We talk about feral cats. We talk about the first cat and the evolutionary history of cats. 5 different groups of cats currently living on the planet. Where do cats originate from? Different breeds of cats, and then people that actually do the breeding cats. The genetics of cats, where cats roam outside, and the future of cats. Again, we cover so many things. The conversation's about 2 hours, and both times, Jonathan's been so generous with his time, and I'm always deeply appreciative when guests do that. I'm pretty sure he gave me, if not 2 hours, close to it last time about convergent evolution, and then he gave me another 2 hours this time to talk all about cats and their evolutionary history. And so I was very pleased with this conversation. His book is wonderful. Everyone should get out and go buy it. And as usual, if you want to listen to this conversation and all other conversations, follow me on my free Substack at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube. Follow and subscribe there. Tell your friends and everybody about the podcast and get them to subscribe as well. And now I bring you Jonathan Losos. I'm here with Jonathan Losos. Jonathan, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast. I'm really looking forward to talking with you again.
Well, I'm delighted to be back.
Yeah, we had a wonderful conversation last time about your previous book on convergent evolution. It was Improbable Destinies. Is that the title? I think that's right.
That is the title. Yep.
It's still, I think, one of the best books I've read, at least in kind of a popular science book on convergent evolution, and we had a great conversation about that. So it's absolutely wonderful.
Thank you so much. I love hearing comments like that.
Yeah, well, I've got a lot of people that have reached out to me when they've listened to that and said that the conversation was great, but then they went and got your book, and so yeah, it's a great book. Highly recommend it. And your follow up was a little bit unexpected in some ways, and in other ways, it kind of makes a lot of sense. But you wrote a book on cats, on the evolution of cats, and I remember when we talked, you had said that you were working on your next one, and so. I'm a big cat lover. I have two cats of my own, and I'm so excited to talk with you about it. I was able to read your book. It's brilliant. It's fantastic. Much like the other one, there's not a lot of books like this where it's talking about the evolutionary history of cats and many of the similarities and some differences of domestic cats versus wild cats. And so you just have a knack at just creating these really special books. They're very unique books. So it's great. So I'm excited to talk to you about that. I guess two questions here before we get started. Just kind of give us your, kind of thumbnail sketch of, who you are, what your background is, and what you currently do. And then second, why you wanted to write this book on cats.
Absolutely. Well, so my name is Jonathan Losos. I am a biologist. I focus on studying evolution, how species diversify, how they adapt to their particular environmental circumstances. I'm a professor at Washington University in St. Louis, a professor of biology. I'm also the director of something called the Living Earth Collaborative, which is a biodiversity center that's a partnership between WashU, the Missouri Botanical Garden, and the St. Louis Zoo. It turns out St. Louis has these three institutions that all excel in issues related to biodiversity. And so we had the idea, why not get together and make the whole greater than the sum of the parts? And so that's what I do. That's my day job. My research throughout my career has focused on lizards, particularly lizards of the genus Anolis. Anyone who lives or has been to Florida or Caribbean islands knows these lizards. They're very common. But they're also a great evolutionary success story. There are 400 species of them that live throughout this area, Central America, down into the tropics of South America. And so I've spent my career studying how they've evolved, how they've adapted, why this group is particularly so successful. So that's my day job. That's what I've been doing for my career. And so I can understand why you were a little surprised to see me writing a book on cats. That kind of comes out of the blue. So let me explain how that happened. And in some sense, this all begins at age 5, when my mother and I went to the Animal Protection Association in St. Louis, where I again live, and adopted a rescue Siamese cat for my dad, who loved cats, and it was a surprise for his birthday. And the cat was a big hit, and we got another cat from the same place a couple years later. And I've fallen in love with cats, ever since then, ever since age 5, my entire life. I've loved cats. But as I went through my career developing as a biologist, as an undergraduate, a graduate student, and so on, it never remotely crossed my mind to study cats, domestic cats. And the reason is that I didn't think there was any interesting research to be done. I didn't think there were people studying cats, and the little research that was being done, I thought probably wasn't very interesting. So I was happy to pet a cat whenever I saw one, or once I settled down to get my own cats. But the idea of doing research on them, the scientific aspects, no way. And then what happened about 10 years ago, 2 things happened. First, the BBC put out a great documentary called The Secret Life of the Cat. And it basically showed a bunch of scientists in England studying all the cats in a village there, and using all the tools that I use on lizards and people use on elephants and lions and hippos, radio tracking them, doing genome studies, looking at isotope analysis to what they eat, just studying them in every way that people study wild species. And at the same time, probably the world's leading authority on cats at the time, John Bradshaw, an English scientist, wrote a popular book that was very successful called Cat Sense. And I read that book, and I gobbled it right down. And so the combination of that book and the documentary just opened my eyes that actually people were studying cats. Scientists were studying them in all kinds of interesting ways and finding out all kinds of interesting things. And so that was a real revelation to me. And then I had what I humbly say was a great idea. And that idea was to teach a class, a freshman class called The Science of Cats. And the idea was that I would sucker the students in on the subject of cats, and then I would teach them how we study wildlife, how we study biodiversity, simply using cats as the vehicle. And so this was when I was back at Harvard before moving to Washington University, and we had this fabulous class of Harvard freshmen, and we did all kinds of great field trips and had a great time, and it was really quite successful. And I enjoyed it, they enjoyed it, and I think they learned a lot. In fact, most of them went on to major in some aspect of science. Well, I taught this course just as my previous book that you mentioned, Improbable Destinies, was winding up and getting published. And so as I finished that, I liked writing that book. It was, I thought, a wonderful experience. I thought, what comes next? And the idea was obvious. Let's take this book on cats and this course on cats and turn it into a book. And so that's what I did. And the idea is basically the same, is to get people who are interested in cats and teach them all the different ways that scientists are studying them. And I have to be clear, domestic cats, not lions and tigers, just the domestic cat, both the free-ranging ones and the pet ones. But teach them how we study biodiversity using cats as the example. So that was the idea behind the book. It turns out it took me longer to write than I expected because there's actually more scientific research than I realized. And my angle on this book is this is a scientist discussing the science of cats. And so I really had to get on top of that. And it took me longer than I expected. But I did it. The book is done. It's now come out. And that's how I came to write that book.
Well, I mean, you did a great job. I mean, obviously you're a great writer, but I was trying to figure out, I haven't really read a book like that. And so when I was reading it, I was trying to figure out kind of what the outline of it was going to be and what the angle was and all of these things. And it's cool because you start the first, quarter of the book just kind of talking about in a really nice cohesive way, many of these fun facts about cats and many things that we kind of know or see, like, why do, I'm sure we'll talk about many of them, but why do cats have certain types of meows and, making biscuits, and all these, why their tail goes up and things that if there's any cat owner will know is we see these things all the time and what are they up to? And so it pulls you in the beginning. And then you talk more about in the middle of the book, about hybridization and breeds and different species and then the history of it. And then towards the end about kind of some of the things you were mentioning, the science of it, of, attaching cameras onto cats to see where they roam at night and in the day and all of these things. And so the book does have this kind of like it grips you, pulls you in the beginning, and it's really, really cool. And then you're hooked in, and then you just want to know more and more. And so it's a great book. I mean, it was super easy to read. And I think for anybody that's a cat lover will love the book. And even people that don't like cats, I think would give them a little bit more of a soft spot for cats after reading your book. So it's a win-win in my opinion. So
that would be a great outcome.
So okay, that's super interesting. I'm glad you shared the story because I was curious. I know you're really big on lizards, certain types of lizards, and studying them. So I was trying to make that connection. It's like, how did you get to this? That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so let's kind of start sort of with some of the beginning pieces of it. For domesticated cats, so cats that aren't lions and tigers and wild cats, many people have said, and I was just curious to see where you went with this, and is that I have two tabbies, let's say, so two tabbies, or other types of what you would say house cats. People say that they're semi-domesticated or they're not fully domesticated, or if the cat was bigger, they'd probably try and eat you, or people say things like this, and you basically confirm that. Could you just, I mean, we can talk about domestication and more of the specifics later, but just I think the overview, what is it that makes, it's kind of the subtitle of the book, cats that are out in the savannah and cats that are in the jungle and cats that are in your living room and getting into things and playing and running around in your house, how is there not a lot different? How is there a lot of similarities between all of these cats?
Well, many domestic cats are not very different from their ancestor. Their ancestor is the North African wildcat, and we can talk later about how we know that. And many domestic cats look like a wildcat. In fact, I like to say that if a North African wildcat walked through your backyard, your response would not be, "What's that North African wildcat doing in New Jersey?" It would be, "What a cool looking cat. I've never seen one quite like that." I mean, they are that similar in appearance. Now, of course, domestic cats have developed different colors and hair texture and so on that you don't see in the North African wildcat. But many tabby, like your tabbies, probably look pretty similar to the North African wildcat. So in appearance, many cats haven't changed very much. It turns out they haven't changed very much in other ways as well, in terms of their anatomy, in terms of their behavior. They're not very different, most domestic cats, from the North African wildcat. And think about, for example, the difference between a dog and a wolf.
Mm-hmm.
You're never going to mistake most dogs for a wolf. They're just so different in so many ways. Not only their anatomy, but their behavior and so on. That's just not true for cats. The number of differences are much smaller. And people have confirmed that now by looking at the DNA and the number of changes that natural selection caused in the domestication of the cat is much smaller than in the process for the dog. And I guess the last thing I'd say about this is just the fact that domestic cats so easily go feral and adopt a wild lifestyle shows how little change they are from their ancestors. So that's what people mean when they say that the cat is barely domesticated or semi-domesticated or something like that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we can talk about the different breeds and things like that, but there's a large diversification of cats all around the world, right? We don't just have like 3 or 4. I think you say somewhere I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but there's a certain amount of wild cats and there's a certain amount of domestic cat. Is it in the 60s or something like that? There's different types
of the species of wild cats, of wild felines. The number is debated a little bit among specialists, but about 42 species of wild felines. And some of them are the big ones we know and love, lions and tigers and leopards. But most of those species are small species that many of them are spotted, but not all. And many of these species no one has ever heard of. The codcod, the ancilla, the tigrina, just to name a few. And there are lots of these little feline species in Africa, Asia, and South America. And so there are quite a few different species of felines.
But what the interesting thing about that and all of it is that there's a lot that links them together. There's a lot that connects them. I mean, in many, many different ways in how they appear, but then also in some of their behaviors. And you talk about this in terms of their communication, which I found was super fascinating. I never realized that cats, it's not like cats don't talk to each other, or I should say meow to each other, but you make this point in the book that cats really meow often or a lot with humans or with their owners. Again, it's not that they don't, maybe with other cats, but really it's with humans. What are the ideas or the hypotheses that are there for how cats use a mode of communicating, meowing, if you will, to humans so much relative to other cats that they may know or cats in their own family? What do we think is up to that kind of way of communicating with humans?
Well, it seems from the data we have that cats meow more to humans when they're trying to communicate with us than they meow to each other. In fact, the standard wisdom in the scientific literature is that cats rarely meow to each other as a way of communicating. Now, they have many other sounds they make. They will growl at each other. They will screech and do other noises that they do communicate to each other, hiss. But the meowing is not used very much from one cat to the other. But they do meow to people. And so one of the ideas is that as cats were domesticated, as they evolved to be the domestic cat, they evolved to meow more to people. And one interesting corollary of that is I should tell you that almost all small species of cats meow. It's not something that just our pets do, that all small felines will meow. And when you compare the meow of the domestic cat to its ancestor, the North African wildcat, they sound different. The North African wildcat makes a very loud, insistent meow, kind of meow, whereas the domestic cat, as a generality, has a much higher pitch, sweeter sound, meow, something like that. And if you play recordings to people who listen to them, not knowing what they hear, number one, they can definitely tell them apart. And number two, they prefer the meow of the domestic cat. And so it seems that the cat has altered not only its behavior of when it meows to us, but also how the sound of its meow to make it more pleasing. And some people have speculated that we have a preference for high-pitched sounds, perhaps because children make those high-pitched sounds. And so the cats have sort of manipulated us by evolving a meow that gets our attention in a pleasing way. But that is one of the differences for sure, that North African wildcats versus the domestic cats is the sound of their meow.
Is it possible with that hypothesis that it's a type of coevolution that happened as cats started hanging out more with humans, that they just started to co-evolve this way of saying, well, when I'm making this sound with, humans I hang out with, I get, food, or I get attention or things like that. Do we think it's something like that where it's co-evolved or no?
So the co-evolved, I think what you're saying is that as in addition, humans evolved to more respond positively to that sound.
Yeah.
It's certainly possible. I don't think there are any data suggesting that the human side of that evolution, but it's certainly possible. One of the big questions, I think we'll probably get into this, is how domestication occurred, and it was probably a back and forth, a yin and yang of us of the cats getting the benefit from being around us, of us seeing the benefit of having them around and rewarding them and kind of going back and forth. And so something like that could have happened.
Yeah, you mentioned also that it seems that the meows for domesticated cats with humans seems to be individualized, right? So could you say more about that?
Absolutely. So most people who've had a cat understand that cats have different meows, that, the different sounding meows that they use in different contexts. And so a researcher named Nicholas Nicastro was interested, is there a meaning to those meows? Do all cats meow in a certain way when they're hungry, in a certain way when they're content, in a certain way when they're upset, and so on? And so we did an experiment where he was based at Cornell University in Ithaca. So he went to a bunch of friends and houses and people with cats and recorded those cats meowing in 5 different contexts, just when they were content and happy, when they were being brushed the wrong way, so they were unhappy, when they were enclosed in a room they wanted to get out of, and a couple of other contexts. And so I can't remember how many cats, he got these 5 different calls. And then he played those calls again to people just wearing headphones and said, guess which context this is. Is this a happy cat, a hungry cat, or whatever? And, that's all they told the person. The person guessed. And for the most part, people guessed barely better than random, barely better than just guessing. And so what that suggests is that even though there are different types of meows, that is to say, even though each cat has different types of meows, there's no universal language that you can hear any cat and understand what it means. Now, then some other researchers followed up in a very clever way. They did kind of the same experiment, but they included in the experiment, the first experiment was just a bunch of random people off the street who listened to these meows. The second experiment was again a bunch of random people off the street, but also the owner of the cat, the person who lived with that cat. And it turned out that the person who lived with that cat was much better at knowing the context of the call than just any random person. And so what that suggests is that the meows are meaningful, but every person who lives with a cat, they kind of negotiate their own private language, if you will, or it's understood what those meows mean but that's on every single case, the cats develop that separately. So there's no universal language, if you will. So that seems to, now how that happens, we actually don't know. Some people have suggested that that the cat tries out different meows and sees what works in a certain context. We don't know. Mm-hmm. But the fact is that this result shows that people who live with cats understand much better than random what those cats are saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. As I mentioned earlier, I have two tabbies, different ages. One's 10, one's almost 5, and we got them at different times and different periods, and they get along well together. But they definitely meow differently, and they definitely have different types of ways of communicating with each of us here in the house. Right? It's not wildly different in terms of the sound of the pitch, but it's definitely the one tabby talks more to me, and the other one, the older one, talks more to my wife. And so it's interesting how they foster also relationships, things like that. And you can hear the different sounds in their meow. One's very high pitched, one is less so, and so it's very, and they do it for different reasons. And again, the purring. So I know other cats purr as well, but for domestic cats, they can purr when they're content and they're just kind of relaxed and they're happy, but also they purr when they're hungry as well, right? So there's different times when they're purring, and there's different types of purrs. Could you talk about that?
Yep. I'm glad you asked about that. So just as cats have different meows, they also have different purrs, and I think most people are aware of that. That in particular, there's a purr that's just a content purring sound. I don't know about you, but when my cat's on my lap making that sound, it's like, oh, life is good.
It's great.
Wonderful. But there's also a much louder, more insistent purr, kind of brum, brum, yes. Which is often when they're hungry or they want something. Yeah. And so some researchers did this cool study where they wanted to get both sorts of purrs. And to do this study, they told people that when your alarm goes off in the morning, don't get out of bed. And I guess these are people who fed their cats in the morning. Don't get out of bed. And they predicted that the following would happen, and it did. The cat jumped up on the bed, positioned itself right by the person's ear, and gave us brr, brr, brr. It's called a solicitation purr. And so there's these two different purrs. And so then again, they did an experiment with people listening with headphones, and people could definitely tell the two purrs apart. And they rated the solicitation purr, the brr brr one, as much less pleasant than the other purr, the contented purr. So these two purrs really do exist, and people can tell them. But then they did something very cool. They did a computer analysis of the audio sound, the spectral analysis, and they isolated the part of the solicitation purr that gave it that insistent aspect. They could find just this is what's added. And then when they digitally subtracted that from the tape or from the file, then when they played it again to people, say, oh yeah, it sounds great. So they definitely found the part that was annoying or discordant. And then they looked at that in detail, and they said, the digital signature of this sound is very similar to a human baby crying. And so their idea was that the cats had added that to their purr to really get the attention of someone. Now, I have to say, when I read this paper, I thought that was going a little too far. I thought that sounded like nonsense. All right, I certainly believe there's a different purr, and you can see the differences. But to say that it sounded like a baby crying, I was pretty dubious. Then I listened to some recordings that the researchers made available on the website where they published the paper. And if you listen to those recordings of a cat purring, remember, this is a cat purring, the brr, brr. You listen carefully, yeah, there's a baby crying in there. You could hear it.
Yeah.
And I was shocked, but it's really there. And you can go on the internet and find some of these. Google solicitation purr or something else like that, and listen for yourself. But so the idea is that humans have a innate sensitivity to the sound of babies crying. It's something that's evolved through time for obvious reasons. And so cats have taken advantage of that and molded their purr in a way that will get get our attention.
Mm.
There's actually a scientific name for this phenomenon. It's called the sensory bias hypothesis. It's the idea that a species will take advantage of the sensory system of a receiver to manipulate it. So it's often that males will make a call that females are particularly good at hearing, and say frogs. But this is the same phenomenon. So it's another way in which house cats probably have evolved to adapt to living to us. And I say probably because I'm betting that the North African wildcat does not have that human baby sound in their solicitation purr, if they even have a solicitation purr. But excuse me. But no one has ever actually tested that idea. Someone should go out and record the wildcats call, but my purr. But my bet is that they won't have that.
It's so interesting again how cats can learn to communicate differently with humans, or when they're living in certain environments, but also how they behave as well, and some of their sociality. But you make this distinction, which I felt was important. So you can tell us why it's important. But between tame and domesticated cats, and you can mention the kneading, making biscuits here if you want as well. But what is this like tame, domesticated cat difference here, and why is it important?
Well, so it is important to understand the difference between a tame animal of any sort and a domesticated one. A tame animal is simply a individual of a species, usually of a wild species, that is usually raised from a baby, and because it was raised around people, it behaves non-aggressively, non-dangerously. It's an animal that's okay to have around the house. And there are lots of animals that if you get a baby one and raise it nice in a nice way, it will be a nice animal. In fact, over the eons, people have raised, I think, 14 different species of cats as tame cats. Mountain lions, for example, are said to make decent, tame mountain lions, decent house pets. Now, I'm definitely not encouraging this. It's a bad idea for many ways, but people have done it. And this is true of lots of other animals as well. But those animals are genetically no different from their wild counterparts. It's just how they were raised that makes them be pleasant to be around to people. By the same token, if, say, that mountain lion that you had as a tame mountain lion then went back in the wild and had babies, the babies would be just as wild as any mountain lion that was raised in the wild. On the other hand, a domesticated animal is an animal that has evolved. It has incorporated genetic changes as a result of being around people, and specifically, those changes, some of them at least, have been evolved for the benefit of people. That it's not just that they've evolved to live near us, but some of the changes have occurred to benefit us. Now, so that's essentially the difference between domestic and tame. And so, think of a pig or a dog. Well, if you think of some of the changes of those species from their ancestors, a lot of those changes are good for us. The dog being so obedient, being so friendly to us, the pig being fat and producing a lot of food. Those are domesticated animals. And I would say fully domesticated, whatever that means, because we get back to the question of the cat being semi-domesticated. It hasn't changed that much, particularly to benefit us, but it has in a few ways. So that's the difference.
What about this kneading behavior they do in terms of, again, I think you mentioned this in terms of the domesticated or animals that are okay to be with humans if they're tame, but this making the biscuits, right? They won't do it just with humans, also do it for their space as well, right? When they're trying to, many of my cats, they'll do it on a certain blanket to say that this is kind of mine, or trying to calm themselves. What do we understand about this behavior? It's very fascinating behavior. It's what do we make of it?
I have to be honest, it's still confusing. It is. So here's what we know. I think probably all wild feline species, including domestic cats too, babies, when they're nursing from their mother, will often do the kneading on her belly, presumably to help stimulate milk flow, through the nipple to drink. It is thought that this kneading behavior of domestic cats in other contexts is for some reason a prolonging of that juvenile or infant behavior.
Mm.
But why that happens isn't very clear.
Mm.
We really don't know. It's
Mm.
also unclear the extent to which wild species will need as adults. They'll all need as babies.
Mm-hmm.
And there are reports on the internet, but it really hasn't been well studied to know, whether this retention of needing behavior into adulthood is something that's just characteristic of domestic cats or not.
It's interesting. When I see both my cats do it, I never really understand why they do it either. It seems that they enjoy it, but it's very interesting behavior though. And they'll sometimes do it on like my chest or or my legs, but sometimes they'll just do it by themselves when they're just laying down, and they'll just it's very peculiar. It's very interesting, and they don't do it all the time. It's like a kind of once in a while kind of thing. It's just very interesting.
But when they're doing that, are they also sticking their claws out?
Yeah.
Sometimes you haven't clipped their claws in a while. It's like, oh, this is cute, but it's painful too.
Right. Yeah, it's one of those. The claws will come out, but like in a way where it's not aggressive. It's just like kind of it's just retracting and then coming out. It's a kind of back and forth, but it's very interesting though. It's always nice when they do it, but and it seems like they're having a good time. But I don't know. It's very, very interesting. Okay, so let's talk about just real quick about their sociality, I guess, with other cats and then maybe with humans. You talk about that wild cats are truly social, such as lions, and there are semi-social cats, such as cheetahs, and then asocial cats, which you would say are all the rest in terms of wild cats. So how did we discover this, and how there's this different I don't want to say a hierarchy, but there's these different dimensions of sociality with wild cats, and then where do domestic cats fit in, and how they're social with other cats in a house or in a neighborhood, and then social with humans?
Well, great question. Everyone, I think, is familiar with the prides of lions. They live in these groups, sometimes quite large. They are female structured groups. They're often the descendants of one female lioness and her offspring, and sometimes several generations of offspring. But the females stay put, and the males, when they get old enough, they leave the pride and go somewhere else. And so they'll have these large groups. They're very social. They groom each other. They lie around. They communally take care of cubs. They hunt together. A great example of a social animal. And with one exception that I'll get to in just one second, no other wild feline is like that. That the research on tigers and leopards and mountain lions and so on shows them to, for the most part, spend their lives living individually. And they come together to mate, and the female then raises her cubs. But other than that, they don't really interact socially. And I want to come back to that if we can remember in just a minute. There's a big asterisk to that question.
Sure.
But for the most part, most wild species are social loners, if you will, for the most part. Now, the cheetah is one exception in that adult males are males that grow up together, stay together and form a band that live together, that do hunt together, and they try to court and mate with females as a group. The females don't live together, so it's not like a pride of lions, but the males are they call them bands. And so maybe that's semi-social in a way. And so that's the one other exception in the wild cat world. Mm-hmm. So then we have the domestic cat. And the domestic cat has a reputation as being a loner, that they're asocial, they go their own way. Cats are just fine by themselves. Turns out that's not at all true. Well, no, that's too much. It's true in some ways, but when cats go feral in places where there is not much food, they do live seemingly by themselves, very much like all wild cat species. They come together to mate, and the female raises the kittens, but other than that, they live alone. But in places where food is abundant, as is very common in what are called community cats or colony cats, where there are a bunch of unowned outdoor cats, but people are supplying them with food. So there's tons of food. cats form social groups that are strikingly similar to lion prides, that you will have a group of cats that all the related is again based on the females. All the related females huddle together, they groom each other, they're very friendly to each other. They even help raise each other's young. They probably help defend against dogs and other things, but they're in many respects very similar to a lion pride. They're not nice at all to cats that they aren't related to, but they form these groups. And so it turns out that that the domestic cat in many ways is similar to a lion and can be when circumstances are right. And those circumstances are a lot of food and related females living together over multiple generations. They can be a very social species.
It's interesting. Where do, I guess, feral cats, I mean, maybe you can define what people mean by that, but feral cats come into the picture with, I guess, domesticated cats? Because sometimes when if somebody goes to like a rescue or a shelter or whatever, and they'll get a cat, and sometimes they'll do a marking to show, like they'll clip the top of the ear to show that this cat is feral. Like they're always going to be skittish, or they're not going to be able to be really good around other people or things like that. And sadly, I mean, these cats don't have a good outcome a lot of the times. But then there are cats that will live outdoors and they just don't have a home or an owner. So what is this understanding about feral cats and how they are with domesticated ones?
Well, so I can get in a lot of trouble here with terminology because
Okay.
there are lots of different terms for particular cat situations. And, some people say that, well, like there's 3 types, and some people say there are 30 types. So
Wow.
just to generalize greatly, understanding there's gray areas and so
Sure.
on, a feral cat usually refers to a cat that has lived its entire life on its own. And usually when it's used is referring to a cat by itself, that living out in the wilderness, where cats usually live at low population densities because it takes a lot of food to feed a cat. Then there are these groups of cats that live in urban areas usually, or suburban areas, where people are feeding them. And they're unowned, they live outside, and some of them have been living outside for generations. Some are just, they got lost, or someone dumped them, dumped them there. And so it's a mix of how long they've been living there. But they interact with people to some extent. They're usually pretty skittish, not always. But people, very kind-hearted people bring them tons of cat food and so on. And so they're living out there. And then there's kind of all kinds of different combinations of these situations. Now, what you were referring to a moment ago about them being skittish and so on is a cat that any cat has a very important period when it's growing up, from roughly 2 or 3 to 7 or 12 weeks, somewhere in there. Different authorities say different numbers, where the extent to which they interact with people will determine how friendly they will be as an adult cat. That if you take a kitten, even if you grab a kitten out of the, whose mother is completely feral, living on her own, get it at 2 or 3 weeks, and then just handle it a lot and treat that cat well, it'll be a very well socialized cat and be very good living around people. Conversely, you can take any cat you want, take some Persian cat or a purebred cat or any cat, and if you just don't give it any experience with people during that critical window, it will never be a loving cat. It will always, it will never be a great house cat. Now, it varies. Cats vary from one to the other. And I have heard some success stories of people saying, well, we took this cat that grew up in the wild and we treated it very nice, and it turned into a nice cat. And so it may be possible occasionally, but their experience during this critical phase is critical to how well they will interact with people.
Do we know why? What's unique about that particular phase between these weeks or whatever? Is there anything unique in the development of the cat that is helpful for that socially?
I'm not sure that we really understand that all that well. It's actually been surprisingly little studied, particularly in recent years. And part of the problem is to study that, in the best way possible. You would have to you'd have to raise a bunch of unsociable cats, and And then what do you do with them?
Yeah.
So I can see why that research is probably unethical, or at least people don't want to do it.
Sure.
I should say that dogs have a similar sensitive phase in their growth. It's, I think, a little later, just a couple of weeks later. But again, a puppy that doesn't have any contact with humans before, I think, about 14 weeks of age will also never turn into a great house dog.
Interesting. It's
So
very
both
interesting.
species have that.
I'll just say real quick. So I mentioned one of my tabbies, the 5-year-old. We got her when she was 4 months old, and she was in. So that when we got her at the shelter or whatever, they had we saw her there, and she was very sweet, but they had clipped the ear. They thought she was feral, and poor thing. I mean, she was very sweet but very anxious, and we decided to take her, and they had said that they had found her in a hoarder home, that they had found her. There's no really people. Maybe it was an abandoned home. They weren't sure, and they just found her in a mattress. Underneath a mattress. Just kind of hiding there. And the reason they thought she was feral is kind of the things you explained. This critical period of when she was alive, those 7 to 10 weeks or whatever it is, that there's no interaction with other humans. And interestingly, she's done a lot of progress and come a long way. But yes, to this day, she's 5. She's lived with us since she was 4 months old. Sorry, so 4.5 years or whatever it is, more than that. She's very sweet and social, but it's social kind of with us one-on-one, but she doesn't come out too much. She will be very anxious. If someone comes over, it could be one person. I mean, you won't see her the whole time. If you make too much noise, she'll hide under the couch. And again, we're very kind to her. She has a great home. She she eats well and she plays, and she does interact with us, but she's still very cautious. It's interesting because the other cat, we got him when he was 9 or 10 months, and he's 10 now. Yeah, just the most social cat you ever. He's super social. I mean, he'll lay in the middle of the living room when there's 10 people around, and he'll just look up, and he loves it. And it's always interesting to think of that. And I did not know that. I didn't know that there was this period, and that makes a lot of sense. While even still years later, she still has a lot of challenges. She's come a long way. She's very sweet, but she's just very anxious, though. Very, very anxious.
A lot of what we're talking about here and talking about tame animals and so on is really this old concept of nature versus nurture. It's nature being the genes of an individual have a large impact, and some types of cats have genes that make them friendlier and so on. We can talk about that later. But there's also the nurture, their environment as they're raised. And this example is showing the strong effect of nurture on cats. How they're raised really has a major effect on how friendly they will be.
Yeah, I firmly believe in that. I mean, I think you can see it, and you can see in the different personalities of cats and how they are in certain periods. And yeah, I think it's always tough going to a shelter and seeing all the ones that won't, kind of get a home and stuff. It's really, really tough, and where they come from.
Let me explain the ear clip thing, what that's about.
Yeah.
There's a program that's widely practiced throughout the United States and the world called trap, neuter, return. And the idea is for these colonies of unknown cats, the idea is no one wants cats living outdoors. It's not it's much better not to have that. And so an approach to try to get those colonies to disappear through time is to capture the cats, take the ones that are friendly and foster them and get people to adopt them. But the ones that aren't friendly, you give them some vaccinations and sterilize them, neuter them, and then put them back where they were. And so the ear clip is a way of knowing, oh, we've already got that cat. And the idea is that if you can neuter a large enough percentage of the population will dwindle away to nothing. Now, I will say that idea is highly controversial because the problem is that the cats breed like rabbits. They can breed 3 times a year, and so if you don't get enough of the females, the ones that are left will just pump out the kittens, and the population. And since those kittens, since there's less competition, they'll survive and the
Mm,
population won't decline. So it takes a
mm,
very sustained effort with a lot of resources and manpower to really to sterilize enough of the cats to get the population to decrease. And
mm.
turns out there's a big argument about how successful TNR can be.
Interesting.
The data can be
Mhm.
read multiple ways.
Interesting. That's very, very interesting. So let's talk about some evolution. So
Let's do it.
what's the tell us about the first cat as much as we know, and kind of just the evolutionary history of cats and how these different branches and lineages arose, and when this started. Just tell us about the evolution of the cat.
Sure. And I will say that in some ways, cats have had a pretty boring evolutionary history compared to other groups. And I say that because to a large extent, a cat's a cat. And so the first fossil cat we know of, something called Proilurus lemonensis,
Hmm.
occurred about 30 million years ago. And looking at its skeleton, it's a cat. Now, its legs were a bit shorter than most cats, but otherwise, if one walked down the street, you'd say, oh, there's a kind of short-legged cat.
Hmm.
For the first 10 million years of cat existence, not much happened. A few species of Proilurus have been discovered, but that's about it.
Hmm.
Now, the one big interesting event, if you will, in cat evolution occurred about 20 million years ago when the cat world split into two lineages. One lineage is the saber-toothed cats. And now that is, if you saw a saber-toothed cat, you'd say it's a cat, but whoa, that is quite a cat, especially the big ones with those long dagger-like teeth and so on.
Right.
And so they diversified quite widely, and there are many species of them. In fact, many more known species of saber-toothed cats than the other type of cat, which I'll get to in a moment. And why that isn't clear. Now, one thing people don't realize, I think most people, is that 10,000 years ago, saber-toothed cats were wandering the American West, that the La Brea tar pits is full of saber-toothed cats. And this was 10,000 years ago in Los Angeles. So our ancestors undoubtedly interacted with these saber-toothed cats. There's no doubt about it. So anyway, that branch of the cat feline tree diversified many species, and then the last ones disappeared 10,000 years ago.
So they were around for a long time.
Yes, they were.
Millions of years.
Yes.
Wow.
Absolutely.
Wow.
The other lineage of cats is called the conical toothed cats. Not the most exciting name, but in other words, their teeth weren't long and dagger-like and flattened like saber-toothed cats. They were like a cone. And that's the lineage that all of today's living cats belong to. And we actually don't have that many fossils of them through that 20 million year period. And the question is that because they were less common, or is it just for some reason they didn't fossilize as well, or we haven't found them, or what? We don't know. But those are the two branches of the cat evolutionary tree, and they've led to the 42 or so species that are alive today. Now, the last thing I'd say about this is we can trace the modern living cats share their most recent common ancestor. The ancestor of today's 42 or so species lived about 11 million years ago. And so the species of living cats that are around today all date back to one ancestral species from that time.
It's interesting how it when you describe it, it seems very simple. It's not too complicated. It's very interesting. Cats sounds like they don't change much, roughly.
No, it's kind of they found a winning formula and stuck with it. And one of the things I say in the book is most groups of diverse animals today, you look at their fossils and there's some weirdos that don't look like any of them. Like sloths, for example. The sloths had a relative that was a giant ground sloth that could stand 20 feet tall.
Right.
Or crocodiles. There were species that walked on land and had hoof-like feet. So many sorts of groups, their fossils weren't all the same. But cats, you could say saber-toothed cats are different. They certainly were different in some ways. But I would say it's like cat's a cat. That's what I'm going to stick with.
Yeah, it's interesting. It reminds me of I've talked to a few people in here about different cephalopods, and they have an interesting story. But the one branch for cephalopods is the Nautilus. And that hasn't changed
Yeah.
that much for millions. I mean, cephalopods have been around for 500 million years. Like the nautilus has not changed that much for millions and millions of years, which is super fascinating. So it's interesting seeing certain parts of our evolutionary tree to how some just don't have that much differences. So you talk about the 5 genetic groups of cats. So I think you start with 4, and then you mentioned a 5th one, if I'm right on this. It's
Yes.
European, Asian, South African, North African, and Chinese. Am I right on this? Right?
Yes, you are.
Yeah.
Well done.
And so tell us about the differences and I guess similarities, but how are these groups different? And how we know the domestic cat only comes from the North African cat.
Okay, that's a great question. So there is a type of cat called a wildcat. Now, just in common usage, wildcat could mean many things, but there is actually a type of cat whose name is the wildcat. Mm-hmm. And it is found throughout much of the Eastern Hemisphere, throughout Europe, much of Asia, throughout Africa, and so on. And there's some differences in their appearance. The ones in Europe look like a gray tabby cat. What color are your cats?
So my one tabby is like he's like a I guess not a macaroon, like a caramel. Like he's got all the stripes. He's got the brown and the caramel and the light brown, and he's like your generic tabby cat. And then the other one we have, the younger one, she's a gray tabby. She's all gray, but they have the stripes. They have the stripes.
Yep. So the European wildcat kind of looks like somewhere between your two cats in that look. Mm-hmm. The African wildcat has longer legs a little bit and a reddish brown coat, although it varies across Africa. And then the Asian one kind of looks somewhat in between, a little bit shaggier in places. And they've always been known as the Asian, European, and African wildcat. Mm-hmm. And people argued, are those just 3 subspecies of one species, or are they 3 different species? But they're all recognized as cats. There's another species that occurs in the mountains of China called the Chinese mountain cat. Mm-hmm. That was long considered to be related to wildcats, but a different species. So about 16 or so years ago, a researcher named Carlos Driscoll, with a big team of collaborators, collected genetic samples of cats around the world. And what he found was, and these were both wild cats from throughout their range, as well as domestic cats living in many places. What he found was 2 things that were surprising. The first thing is that the African wildcat is actually 2 different groups, that the southern ones and the northern ones are genetically quite different from each other. So much so that they are, different entities, if you will. So that makes 4 wildcats instead of 3. And then Driscoll's work hinted at this, and then some further work confirmed it. The Chinese mountain cat actually is related to it occurs within the wildcat evolutionary tree. That the Chinese mountain cat is more closely related to, I believe it's the Asian wildcat, than either of those are to the European wildcat. So in other words, the Chinese mountain cat is a wildcat. So there are these 5 different types. And now people argue, are these 5 subspecies of one wildcat species, or are they 5 different species? And it's for reasons, we could talk about it if you want. It's a tomatoes thing, or it's hard to decide those questions. So I should say this decision was made by looking at their DNA. Driscoll got the DNA and sequenced the DNA and built an evolutionary tree of relationships based on that DNA. And that's how he came to this conclusion. So we had one other finding from this study, and that was all of the domestic cats from around the world. When you look at their DNA, they all group with North African wildcats. So even domestic cats from Europe, they don't group with the European wildcat, they group with the North African wildcat, and the same for Asia. And so what that indicates is that the domestic cat descended from the North African wildcat.
Mm. What do you think it was, I guess, and maybe this gets to the next question about the role of hybridization, but how do we think that these groups, that they're genetically different enough to be considered a group or whatever? What in terms of the evolutionary story here, what do we think happens that we have these at least five now that we know? Maybe there are others out there, but of these wildcats, that they were able to have this, you know, these differences, that they're going to have, differences in different parts of the planet. Why do we think that this happens? Is it just evolution and that's what happens with natural selection, or is it something different?
No, I think it's just evolution by natural selection and other processes, that you get populations that are isolated in different parts of the world, and they're not exchanging individuals very much, and their gene pools just evolve to become different. And some of that is that they're adapting to different situations, and so different genes are being selected in the different places, and sometimes just random differences occur. You think about the differences among any organism spread around the world that has been around the world for a long time. Differences tend to arise. Humans, before we started moving back and forth, there were geographically based differences that evolved in the same way. And so I think it's just an example of, they were in different places for estimates of perhaps hundreds of thousands of years. They'd been separated, and they just kind of went their own way and became different.
So let me ask here, where do cats come from? Right?
Well, so that's the classic question. And the data I just talked to you about, the DNA studies, say that they came, they're descended from the North African wildcat. So then the question is, well, where does a North African wildcat live? And its name is a little misleading, because not only does it occur in North Africa, but it occurs actually somewhere, down halfway through Africa. But more importantly, it also occurs in Asia, in Turkey and Cyprus and Israel and Saudi Arabia, areas that used to be called the Near East. We don't generally refer to it anymore. So sometimes it's called the Near Eastern wildcat. But the problem is neither Near Eastern or North African, it's both of them. But to say the Asian, African, Northern, there's too many words. But anyway, that's where the North African wildcat occurs. And so presumably the domestic cat evolved somewhere in that area. And we can sort of put bookends on where it happened and when it happened in the following way. There is a archaeological find, a site in Cyprus, an island in the Mediterranean near Turkey and other places, where they found a burial of a human about 10 or 11,000 years ago. And at the foot of that individual, the grave, was a cat that very clearly had been laid out carefully next to the human. And the inference was that this was a treasured associate of some sort. Now, some people have argued that shows that domestication may have occurred in Cyprus or somewhere else by 11,000 years ago. But the problem is we don't know. We can't tell a tame wildcat from a domestic cat based on their skeletons. They look identical. And so it could very well have been a wildcat that had just been raised from a kitten and was not domesticated in any way. There is one interesting twist, though. Wildcats do not occur naturally on Cyprus. And we know that from other archaeological discoveries. And so that wildcat or its ancestors had to be brought over there by people. Does that mean that it was a domesticated cat then? We don't know. They brought other things over as well. They brought foxes over. Foxes aren't domesticated. So it's hard to know what that means. But that's kind of one marker that maybe domestication goes back to 10 or 11,000 years and in the vicinity of Turkey. On the other hand, there are paintings in tomb walls in Egypt from 3,500 years ago, more or less, that very clearly show a domesticated cat, a cat wearing a collar, living around the house, in a person's lap. And so I think it's safe to say that by Egypt, 3,500 years ago, cats were domesticated. And so the question is, did it occur in Egypt or did it occur somewhere else and were they brought to Egypt? And when did that happen? And unfortunately, we don't have data that are more definitive on when that happened. The other thing is cats could have been domesticated in multiple different places throughout that region of the world. That this is where the dawn of civilization, where people started living in villages and growing crops and storing grain. One can easily imagine that wild cats started hanging around human habitations in many different places, more or less at the same time, and that the process of domestication occurred in plenty of different places. So it may not have been a single point at a single place in a single point in time.
Yeah, so for some folks that say like it's definitely Turkey, because Turkey has a very big cat population. I mean, cats roam all over Turkey, and it's a big country. But then you have other people say, no, it's definitely Egypt, right? And we have all these things, and basically the bottom line is it's somewhere in that region. We just don't know. We just don't know conclusively.
That's absolutely correct. And
yeah.
We don't at the moment. We don't know. People are still trying to find the smoking gun, and maybe they will. We will see.
Yeah. So you also talk about that there's, let me see if I get this right, 73 breeds of cats and increasing, and that's more than the 42 wild species of cats. Talk about this in terms of breeds, how we understand breeds and domestication. We've kind of mentioned at the beginning, but how there's this ever increasing kind of breeding that happens, whether it's through various routes, and what that means for a kind of ceiling for the evolution of cats.
Well, a breed is a group of animals or plants. They have different use for plants, but a group of animals that basically reproduces and produces the same sort of individual generation after generation. That you mate two individuals of a breed, and they will produce offspring that are generally quite similar. And so through the decades, centuries, even longer, people have been selectively breeding individuals to develop these types called breeds. And in the dog world, where it's been going a little bit longer, there are even more breeds, depending on who you ask, 200 to 400 breeds of dogs. Now, in cats, there are, as you said, 73. It turns out there are different organizations, and so people might know, for example, the American Kennel Club for dogs. They're the ones who put on the Westminster Dog Show. But there are other dog organizations, and each organization has its own set of approved breeds. And the same is true in cats. And so I believe that the 73 breeds are recognized by TICA, which stands for the International Cat Association. The CFA, the Cat Fanciers Association, only recognizes, I think they're up to 45 now. So it's not worth getting into why some organizations represent more than others. But there are these numbers, lots of breeds, and the number is increasing. And many of the new breeds are the result of new mutations that pop up in some individual cat, and then individuals breed descendants of that cat to try to get that trait fixed in the population, to become standard in the population. So let me give you an example. There's, people are probably familiar with the Sphinx, which is the hairless cat. It's the one that was in the Austin Powers movie. Maybe I'm dating myself on that. It's a cat that you look at, it's got this pink, wrinkly skin. Actually, it does have very fine hair. It's not truly hairless, but it doesn't have much hair. Well, that is a mutation that causes the hair to be of that sort. And so individuals, these breeders bred the mutant cat, the cat that had that mutation. I don't want to call it a mutant cat. The cat with that mutation to other cats, and they started selecting the offspring until that trait was present in all the offspring. And then there are other characteristics that they selectively bred for, and then they created this breed, the Sphinx. Another breed that was created in the last few decades is called the American Curl. It's a breed in which the ears fold backwards on the head. They curl back. And so it gives a cat a very unusual appearance. And again, this was a mutation that popped up in a cat that wandered into someone's home. And by breeding the offspring of that cat, they were able to develop that breed. And so there are lots of different traits, different wavy hair. There's now a short-legged cat called the Munchkin, which is the corgi of cats. It really has, from the legs up, it looks like a normal cat, and then you look at the legs, and there are these little toothpick-like things. And so there are lots of other breeds like that. There are some other ways that breeds are developed as well. We could talk about that if you really want to get into breed minutia, but many of them are mutations that come along, and then those individuals are bred.
I guess maybe this is a different type of question, but should we be doing that? I mean, what are the ethics around this?
There are there's lots of opinions on this, and there are certainly situations in which developing purebred cats is a problem. And two of them are, sometimes once you have a breed, those breeds are not static entities, and through time, they can be molded in new ways by the people who breed the cats. The way this works is what's called artificial selection, akin to natural selection. The breeder's simply choosing the animals with the traits that they want and breeding those animals, and evolution occurs. And so the breeders are able to transform what a particular breed looks like. And this has happened, for example, in many breeds, but sometimes in ways that are questionable. The Persian cat, for example, the modern show-winning Persian cat basically has no nose. It's got two little nostrils between its eyes. And some people find it adorable, but it has all kinds of health problems. It's very commonly have health problems. And there are many people who think that that should not have occurred and should not be allowed. And so to the extent that that happens, that is problematic. I will say that most breeds of cats seem to not have general health problems like that. Now, the other problem is, say you breed a cat that has a particular trait, like the curled back ears. Well, to do that, you need to breed all the descendants of that initial cat that had that mutation, because that's the basis of the breed. And so you're going to have a very small gene pool as a result, or you have to work very hard to get other genetic variation. And so the problem is many breeds can not have much genetic variation, and that itself causes problems related to inbreeding. And so there's that issue as well. So there are certainly issues around the development of pedigreed cats and dogs, and it's very controversial. It can be done in ways that are not harmful to the animals, but people have to be careful and responsible to do that. There's also another issue, and that is we have animal shelters full of cats looking to be adopted. Should people be out buying these cats as opposed to adopting a shelter cat? And there are multiple views on that. So it can be very controversial as well.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. I mean, I didn't know about what do they call it? Why am I drawing a blank on the name? They euthanize the cats, right? Is this correct? With the shelter, is this the correct term? I can't remember this correct term, but
yeah, euthanize is the term. It's it occurs much less than it used to. The animal organizations have been quite successful in bringing down the number of cats and dogs that are euthanized, but it still does go on. It still goes on much too much. Part of the problem is getting back to these animals we were talking about that are living outside and unsocialized, and people try to adopt out as many as possible, but some of them just aren't fit to be good pets. And there are some very warm-hearted people and organizations who will take care of these animals, but there's just not room for them all. It's a very difficult question.
Yeah, when I first realized, I didn't realize that for a long time, and then I was talking with somebody about it, and they explained this to me, and I was absolutely crushed. I mean, I couldn't believe that we do that. And I mean, I understand complication, but it really is. It's like we got to find a better way to handle this. I mean, the same for dogs too, or for other animals. I mean, it's not just cats, I don't think, but it really just it's a terrible thing. It's an absolutely terrible thing, and so that's good to know that it's come down. So,
So
but that, to your point though about the breeding and everything, there's plenty of animals out there that need a home, and and maybe we should consider that first, or we should definitely at least consider it before trying to find all these different elements of breeding of sorts. Um, let me ask you about genetics. So I mean, it's kind of what we're talking about here, but you talk about traits and genes and how they impact certain traits. So how do we understand, I guess, just generally traits in and of themselves and how the genes are impacted, where a mutation fits there, and then how do we understand all of the different genetic aspects of how different traits impact certain behaviors, whether it's just for different types of domestic cats or certain cats that are maybe out in the wild or ones that are at home. How do we understand some of the behavioral traits or otherwise for various cats?
Well, that's a big question. And I will say a couple things. First, there's a lot of variety of cats in their appearance, their anatomy, their physiology, and their behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And we would like to know where those differences came from and are there genes responsible for them? And if so, what genes are they?
Mm-hmm.
And in recent years, there have been remarkable strides made in the Human Genome Project has just exploded and led to great understanding of human genetics, the genes that are responsible for all our variation, and understanding how that evolved and how those genes play a role in determining who we are and why people are different from each other.
Yeah.
Well, there's been a lot of work on dogs and cats as well. And we cat people are a little mad that dogs get a lot more attention than cats, but there's been a lot of good cat genome work done also. We are beginning to understand a lot of what the genetic basis is of the differences among different types of cats. Mm. And it turns out that this is interesting in its own right, but it also has importance for humans because the structure, the organization of the DNA of cats, the cat genome, is actually very similar to that of humans. And so we can learn a lot about human DNA by looking at cats and vice versa. And there are, in fact, even some medical/veterinary conditions that seem to be caused by essentially the same gene in both humans and cats. So the research not only is satisfying our curiosity about cats, but also has important implications for humans, as well as for cats, because they're trying to find the genetic basis of many of diseases that various cats tend to have. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so this work is just zooming along, and they keep on finding more and more genes that cause particular conditions, whether it's a disease or a physical appearance in cats. The last I saw, the number was up to, I think, 150 different genes. And so probably the biggest success story so far is a gene that caused a kidney problem in Persian cats called polycystic kidney disease. I think that's what it's called. Mm-hmm. And give me 1 second. I'm going to check to make sure I got yes, polycystic kidney disease. It turns out that it used to be extremely common in Persian cats, and something like 37% of them would have this. And this was, at this time, the Persian cat was the most popular breed of cat in the world. And so this made it the most significant cat disease that we knew of. And scientists discovered the gene. It's a single mutation in a single gene that causes this disease. And this is hugely important for two reasons. You could go out and test all of your Persian cats and find out, do they have the allele, are they carrying that mutation? Yeah. And if so, there are a couple things you can do. One is you can be on the lookout for this disease to develop, or even start treating the cat in ways preventative ways even before the disease develops, and so help treat the cat early on. In addition, you know which cats not to breed. This is a carrier, do not breed that cat. And as a result, the frequency of this mutation in the Persian cat population has plummeted. They've gotten rid of the vast majority of the cats of this mutation in Persian cats. Now, it turns out that there's a sequel to that. It turns out humans have the same disease, more or less. Wow. And so we can go back and forth between understanding how the mutation works in cats and in humans and inform each other. That there is let me see if I have this right. They came up with a new diet for Persian cats that have this disease that's good for their kidneys. And now they're wondering, well, maybe that would work on humans as well. So there is actually interchange between, it's not just good for cats. It actually can be good for humans as well. I mentioned the munchkin cat, the one with the very short legs. Well, it turns out that the mutation that causes that may well have the same effect in humans. There's some evidence that it does. And so again, we can learn a lot about a human condition from the studies of cats. So, also, these researchers are finding traits that aren't of disease relevant to cat disease or human disease, but just cause the trait that we're talking about. That there are some cats that have a particular type of wavy hair. They found the gene that causes that wavy hair. They found the gene that causes the sphinx to be hairless and so on. And so we're getting a much better appreciation of how the genes of these cats cause these various conditions.
Yeah, no, it really grounds it in something that's tangible and really important kind of work for cats, and then what we can learn from cats as fellow mammals. Before I come to the last few chapters in the book, which were super interesting about what outdoor cats do and how we can track them and understand and all that, some fun chapters in there, and some of the studies that were there, which you mentioned earlier. I wanted to ask about just more about cats in terms of personality. A lot of people talk about cats with personality. I'm not sure if there's a lot of work or study that's been done on trying to, again, personality is hard to measure with humans, much less other animals. It does seem like they have, I mean, of course, there'll be those very obnoxious think pieces that say why cats are assholes, or, all these, horrible tropes that people have about cats. And what are your thoughts? I don't think you talk about it much in the book, and maybe there's just not a lot of research out there, but this idea about how they work in terms of their personality functioning, what their individualized personalities are, how they work, or operate, I should say, with their fellow humans they live within a house, but maybe strangers that come and visit, or just how do we understand? I'm talking about domesticated cats at this point. When we say they have a lot of personality, or they like to just they go to the beat of their own drum kind of thing. What do we understand about cats in terms of their quote unquote personality?
Well, you're absolutely right. One cat from the next can vary greatly in its behavior, what we call its personality. How to anthropomorphize, to put human labels on it, how bold they are, how cautious, how adventurous, and so on. There's a lot of variation from one cat to the next. As we've talked about earlier, a lot of it has to do with how they're raised, their environment. That you raise cats in different ways, and it will affect what they're like as an adult. But it's also true that there are genetic differences, and we can see that by looking at breeds, because different breeds of cats do, on average, have different behaviors, and so that must be a effect of the genetic differences among them. And so, like most traits, it's a combination of both genes and environment. And so you look at different breeds of cats. Some are very loving. Some are just layabouts that will just lie in your arms all day. Some are extremely active. And scientists are now trying to get at the genes underlying these behaviors, and that's a little more difficult than some other things. But there certainly are genetic differences that are responsible for behavioral differences. And if I can get back to a question you asked a moment ago about the issues with pedigreed cats and breeding them, one thing that that John Bradshaw, the cat scientist in England I mentioned at the outset, who wrote Cat Sense, has pointed out, and I think he's absolutely correct, is we need to develop cats that are made for modern day living. And in particular, a big problem with many cats is they want to go outside, and when they get outside, they go hunting and they kill lots of birds and other animals. And in an ideal world, we would select for cats that don't want to do that. That you would, and I'm firmly convinced, as Bradshaw is, that we could develop a breed of cats that was not interested in hunting and would be very happy living in a little apartment. So there is absolutely a role for doing this sort of controlled breeding to develop a type of cat, which would be essentially a breed with the traits that we really want them to have. And, this is what we've been doing for dogs for a long time. And this is what it will, when we completely succeed at that, then cats will be more fully domesticated, at least those cats to which this occurs. But that is a positive role of developing breeds and selective breeding, is breeding cats for traits that are beneficial for them as they interact with people.
Yeah. I remember a couple of years ago, there was this big report that some very large number, I was floored, of the I guess is the fatality rate of birds was cats. Cats are out there killing birds and eating them, and I was like, oh my goodness, like I mean, we know that happens. I remember when I was a kid, we had an outdoor cat, and he would bring animals to the front porch, and he'd be like, here's my quote unquote trophy. Here's the squirrel and the mouse and the birds, and it's like, but then when you read the numbers, and it's like, it's a big problem. Like, birds are getting killed pretty significantly by cats.
The numbers were very big. And there is no doubt that in some parts of the world, cats have been a huge problem causing species to go extinct. This has happened on oceanic islands throughout the Pacific and elsewhere, where we have all these animals, usually birds, that have no familiarity with something like a cat, through their evolutionary existence. And so you put a cat there, a master predator, they just go to town. In Australia, this is a huge issue as well. And it's ongoing today because they have probably a couple of million of feral cats living throughout the continent. And there are lots of small species of mammals, also birds and other things, only occur in Australia that are really jeopardized by these cats.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I agree with your point about how do we have cats in a modern society. We, as you mentioned, we've done that with dogs, and so I think that's important. Which leads to the next question. You talk about in the couple of chapters about some of the studies that have been done of putting kind of cameras on cats and trackers and trying to see what they're up to and what they're doing. And just talk a little bit about some of those studies and the research you did about outdoor cats, where they go, where they roam, what are their behaviors outside, what are they up to, what are they doing when they're out?
Well, this is a fascinating thing. It's actually been done in a number of different ways. And so there's two different sorts of research. One is you put a little tracker on a cat and you can just see where it goes. It's usually a little device that just transmits the cat's location that you put on a harness or on a collar. And you can buy these commercially now, and you can actually get one and download the app on your phone and see where your cat is going. Well, scientists have done that for pet cats, just to get an idea of where pet cats go, those that are allowed outside. And also it's been done to some of these TNR colonies to see these cats that live outdoors all the time, where they're going. And it's also done on just feral cats in Australia and elsewhere. The other thing they do is they put little cameras around the collar of the cat. And so the cat goes out and it comes back, you get the camera back and you download the files and you get a cat's eye view of what it's been doing out in the world. And that has gives just a remarkable view of what they're doing. And cats are notorious for being so secretive. And so if you've ever tried to follow a cat around, have you ever tried to follow your cats outside?
No. I haven't followed my cat around outside. They're not really outdoor cats. We let them out in the backyard, and they do enjoy it. But one of the cats, the one that I was telling you about earlier, the one that we got when she was quite small, sometimes she'll stand outside and and she'll be in the backyard and she'll watch all the birds and she'll make like this clicking noise with her throat, right? This clicking of like this, like almost like this anticipatory, like wanting to like to pounce, right? And the other one just kind of watches and enjoys it. But we do usually if we're out of town or whatever, we'll have a camera inside the house, and so we'll just see what they're up to
Ah,
and
ah,
what are they doing when they're inside the house, and what are their kind of activities. And it's not really anything exciting per se. Usually you just see them laying around in the sun, or they'll move from one chair to a couch, or they'll move when they get hungry, or they have these kind of routines. But so that's about the closest I've done. I've never, like I said, when I was growing up, we had an outdoor cat, and I would have loved to have done that, because he would be out sometimes for days, and we thought, oh, he's gone, he's not going to come back. And then he'd come back, and yeah, like I said, a lot of times he'd just bring us animals. I mean, he was a hunter. He was absolutely a hunter. So it's interesting. One time he got into a fight, and he had an injury, and as it happens with outdoor cats. So it's interesting to see what they're up to. And so if you are able to have a camera on them, it'd be super fascinating to see. Have you done this with your cats or no?
I've done that a little with my cats. But there's this fabulous study at the University of Georgia where they put them on cats, and they found all kinds of fascinating things. And it's also been done on wild cats. And I'm just thinking of this University of Georgia study. One cat had a collar on it, and it's walking along, and it looks up. It's at night. You can tell in the black. It looks up, and it's looking at an opossum that is it's on a patio, and so the opossum's up on the railing on the handrail, and the cat's looking at it, and the possum goes walking away, and the cat's following the opossum, and then the possum disappears because there's a window that's very bright, and so you can't see the opossum in front of the window because the window's so bright. And then all of a sudden, the opossum is right in front of the cat. And like, how did it get there? And they're both startled, I think, and they're moving around, and then the opossum waddles away. And it just shows you this interaction that the researchers titled that little clip, which they put online, "Fight with an Opossum." I don't think there was fighting. There was no growling, no hissing. I think they just kind of blundered into each other. Mm-hmm. And then another cat that's underneath a car growling at a dog. Perhaps one of my favorite ones is there's a cat that is on a street, and it runs. You can sort of see what's going on. It runs across the street and ducks into a sewer hole. What do you call it, where the water goes in? Yeah. And it jumps down to the bottom of the sewer, which is about 5 or 6 feet, I'm guessing, and then starts walking through the sewer through this corrugated metal pipe for, I'm guessing, 50 yards. And then it turns to the left and looks, and you can see it looks back, and you can almost think in its mind, is this a good idea? Maybe not. And it turns around and goes back and jumps back up on the street. And so there are all these vignettes of these cats' lives, and which is really fascinating, seeing many things that you just would never get the chance to see. Now, the message of that study, and also the study where they put the trackers on, is cats do a lot of stupid things that, getting in that sewer, what if there'd been a flash, a thunderstorm or something? That cat would have been in big trouble. Mm-hmm. They find that cats, often cross roads much more than you would expect. And they get on roofs, they get underneath cars, and they do all kinds of risky stuff. Mm-hmm. And it really highlighted how dangerous it is to let your cat outside, which is one of the messages that the researchers reported. Mm-hmm. Now, there was also a funny thing from the cat trackers. No, it was also the cameras, actually. They found cats, these are pet cats, entering other people's homes. And you could clearly see it. And there's one the researcher told me this. She said there was one time where the cat, wearing the camera, went in the other person's home, and the owner of that home held up a phone to the cat, like phone calls for you. What was going on there? Who knows? But it turns out that sort of phenomenon is not unusual either.
It's so interesting. I mean, you can kind of hear like the whole things of like, cats have 9 lives, and how they're kind of, curiosity and all these things. But it's interesting how cats they'll get into stuff. And there's this I've seen it in maybe different ways, but like cats have this mischievous nature to them, which is really, I find it endearing. Maybe other people don't like it, maybe, but it's interesting, what cats are doing, whether they're just house cats or they're outdoor cats or they're feral cats. So it's really interesting research to also understand their behavior. And then to your point of how dangerous it is, I always think about when it's really extreme weather as well, when it's really cold or it's really hot. Those poor cats, all animals really, that like dogs or as well, but they're, I mean, they can really suffer. They can die in of extreme conditions, and so I always worry about that too. So
Yep, absolutely true.
yeah. So the last question I have here is kind of how you end the book is the future of cats, right? What does that future look like? You talk a little bit about CRISPR and genetic engineering could be playing a potential role, and I think you mentioned that earlier. And there's some ethical concerns there. More new breeds. How do feral cats become more wild? So you can tackle any or all of those things, or just kind of unpack what is the future of cats, whether they're living with humans or not? What does it look like?
Well, it's an interesting question because I think that cats are poised to move in multiple different directions. On the one hand, there are all these cats that are living outside. They're unowned cats, and they're getting by on their own. Some of them are, and just living basically the wildcat lifestyle. And if you think about what is happening, well, where do new pet cats come from? Other than pedigreed cats, which are a minority of cats that people have, most cats come from shelters and other places like that. And because most cats in the United States, pet cats, are neutered. And so pet cats are not reproducing themselves. For the most part, the pet population keeps on being augmented by these stray cats that are caught, and those that are socialized become pets. What that means, perversely, at least possibly, the data on this they're very limited, is that we are taking out of the wild those cats that are easiest to catch and that are most likely to hang around people, which means that we are selecting for wild cats. The natural selection is favoring those cats that are so afraid of us that they get nowhere near a trap and they don't want to have anything to do with people. So on the one hand, the evolutionary pressure that we are putting on these cats, these outdoor unowned cats, is we're selecting for them to get less friendly, less tolerant of people, because the ones that are like that, we're just removing them from the breeding population. On the one hand, we're encouraging those cats to evolve back towards their ancestors of being wildcats. On the other hand, we are developing new breeds, as we talked about, and more new breeds will probably be developed. And some of these new breeds are important to move forward, that we can select breeds that are beneficial in many ways to make, even better pets. And ideally, ones that don't hunt. It's possible by breeding ones, cats that are happy to sit in your lap and purr contentedly. And so in that sense, we could, as I mentioned before, fully domesticate at least some cats and, change them in the ways we want them to turn into the animals that we would like. That could happen as well. And on the, and yet, so I want to mention one interesting thing that is going on, and has to do with CRISPR, which is controversial. But there is now I have a little fun with what might be done with cat breeding, but actually people are working on CRISPR in cats right now for a very important reason, and that is cat allergies. That something like 20% of the American public are allergic to cats.
Is it that high? 20%?
That's somewhere maybe 15 to 20%.
Wow, that's still a lot.
Yes, it is. I was surprised myself.
Yeah.
Most people who are allergic, it's not a big deal. You have sniffles and sneezing, and maybe if you can't stay around. But for some people, it's really bad news. They go to the hospital from it.
Yeah.
And what causes cat allergies is cats produce a protein in their saliva, and they lick themselves, and then the protein dries up and becomes dander and floats into the air and becomes a dust mite and so on.
What's the name of this again?
It's called FeLD1,
Okay.
feline domesticus. I should know this, allergen 1, something like that. But it's made by a single gene. Scientists have discovered
Really?
this. Yes. And so the idea the scientists have is, can they produce a cat that doesn't produce the allergen, the protein that causes people to be allergic? And in particular, could you manipulate that gene so that it didn't work, so it failed to produce the allergen? And so that's what people are working on right now. Now, there's one problem with that, and that is, well, what if this protein actually does something that's important for the cats? And so by making the gene non-functional, maybe you're going to cause health issues. We don't know whether that's true or not, but it is known that cats can vary widely in how much protein they produce, from lots of it to very little. And this is just naturally occurring variation from one cat to the next, which kind of suggests that the protein can't be that important, because if it were, the ones that don't produce very much wouldn't be healthy. And there's no evidence that this is the case. Nonetheless, this needs to be studied much more carefully, but it does lead to the prospect that using techniques like CRISPR, one could develop a cat that didn't cause any allergies. I do want to say there are actually two ways to do this. One way would be to change the genes in the cat's eggs and sperm so that it gets passed on to the next generation. And that would actually essentially be a breed of cats that were not allergen-free. The problem commercially for that is that once a company has created those cats, how are they going to make any money? Because once those cats are out breeding, the company would have to get into the breeding business, and it would be a big mess. Unless they could, like Big Ag, somehow get a royalty on every cat. Anyway, they're not doing that. The other way of doing it is to find a way to inject the salivary glands with this CRISPR DNA, and just change the DNA in the salivary glands so the cats cannot produce the protein, but yet they don't transmit that to the next generation. I'm getting into the weeds. The point is that
that's great.
that CRISPR, there's a lot of controversy, but CRISPR could produce a cat that would lead to a lot of benefit by getting rid of cat allergies. And so that's research that's going on. Now, it turns out that CRISPR has been conducted on many species of mammals, from many different ones, monkeys, possums, and many others, dogs, but not on cats. And I don't know why that is. And so maybe there's some issue with cats that it won't work. We don't know yet. Anyway, that's ongoing work, another way to shape the cat of the future. But I want to, if I can segue to a broader question, we're just talking about the next century or two, but what about a few millennia from now? Humans are messing up the planet in major ways and causing all kinds of extinction of species, and we're making a huge mess of it. Eventually, we will get past this. Excuse me, and Earth will recover. Unless we completely annihilate the planet, we're probably talking thousands of years from now, natural systems will recover and ecosystems will restore themselves. Who knows what wild species of felines will be left? Will tigers have made it? Lions? Will the African wildcat? We don't know. Many of them will go extinct. Some of them maybe not. But we do know this: there will be cats everywhere, domestic cats. They are, on just about every place that humans occur. And I think it's very likely that when the planet does recover and evolutionary processes kick back in again and start producing new species, the domestic cat will be the source of many new species. You could imagine them adapting, live in the deserts of Australia, and another species evolving in some island with a big mountain. And I suspect that down the line, the descendants of the domestic cat will lead to a diverse group of species that evolve to take advantage of the opportunities they experience.
It's an interesting point. It reminds me of it's a while ago now, but I had on the podcast Mark Beekoff and Jessica Pierce, and they wrote this interesting book. It's a short book. It's like a coffee-sized book called A Dog's World or something like that. And it basically talks about like how would dogs, because they've been artificially selected in many ways, and they're so used to living with humans now for a long time. If humans weren't on the planet, if we go extinct, what will happen to dogs? And what would that be like? And how would what would their evolution continue to look like without humans? And kind of having these types of, wild types of dogs. And it's not a long book. It's really like a thought experiment, but understanding kind of some of the evolutionary history of dogs up to now, and how they are now, and the few dogs that don't live with humans, and what that would look like in the future. And it's interesting, right? What you're saying here about the future of cats, if humans aren't around, they'll still keep going likely, and they'll still be around in different places. But what that would look like is very, very interesting, which is nice because it kind of takes away this kind of human-centered thing, and says that cats have been existing before us, and they probably will after us. And so it's really interesting to think about your house cat, and they got all their DNA inside of them, that they can live with you, but they can live without you too, right?
You're absolutely correct, and many cats would do just fine.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting to think how they might evolve given the chance, if we were gone. It's a fascinating, I've seen that book. I haven't read it carefully, but it's a fascinating idea.
Yeah.
The same applies to cats. And you can imagine that there are many types of dog breeds and cat breeds that could never survive in the wild. These, like the French bulldog and the Persian cat, with all the problems breathing, put them out in nature, they're not going to last a minute. Right. All these long-haired cats will just get matted, but many others could do just fine, and who knows what would happen.
Yeah, it's very interesting to think about. Well, the book is called The Cat's Meow: How Cats Evolved from the Savannah to Your Sofa. And this is out through Viking, which I think is a imprint of Penguin Random House. And it's out everywhere. And where's the best place for people to find you and your work?
Well, I have a website where I have a very unusual last name, Losos, Losos. So I'm easy to Google up. I have a website and have an email there. And so that's probably the best way to find me.
That's great. Well, Jonathan, I mean, it's always so much fun talking to you. I had a really, really good time talking to you last time, and a really good time talking to you this time about an animal we both love and care about. And you've done all the hard work writing a fantastic book about it. And so getting to talk to you about it just makes me super happy. And I'm very certain all of my listeners that are big cat lovers will eat this conversation up. So I hope everyone gets out there and gets your book and they listen. And so I just can't say enough thanks for coming on and giving me your time.
Thank you. I love talking cats, and this has been fun, just as the last time was. So thanks for inviting me on again.
Of course. Thank you.